Hi, Rachel. Ooh, dragon voice. You're brave, Laura. Yeah, we get some vicious feedback. Go high.
Frank, I love coming here and just listening to you. I have all these visions where like someplace desolate and I just listen to you all day long.
Someplace what?
Oh, sorry. Someplace desolate or
Someplace desolate.
yeah,
Well,
where I have no responsibilities except just to listen to you.
was it? Is one of the beatniks, wasn't it?
Something like that,
Desolation
yeah.
Peak. I think didn't Kerouac write a Desolation Peak or something? I think so, maybe so. Well, it's like when all your illusions are stripped away, it kind of looks from the outside looks like desolate, right? Buddha's big discovery is that it's very happy and wonderful there. Yeah, I often think of the wrathful Buddhas. It's just that's how it is, how it appears. It's like I remember way back when for the first time doing some of that practice on a retreat, you've got this terribly scary kind of appearance, and then you do the mantra, and it's all like completely sweet and wonderful. So the effect on the mind is like the opposite of what you see. But it's a wonderful kind of metaphor for samsara too. The Buddhists say that the samsara is like honey on the edge of a razor. It looks so good and you lick it, but you just always get your tongue cut. Or another one they say is a poisonous flower. You sniff it, but you get a headache. Appearances are deceptive. Venus flytrap. Yeah, well, that one looks scary to me to begin with. Okay, well, I was thinking we might finish our book today, but looking at it tonight, maybe not. We'll see. So this little book, Michael Carruthers Buddha, is I think useful for us because it's very literal. It's very. I don't think there's anything in here that sort of rubs the wrong way a modern audience, which is hopeful. Is helpful. Is helpful because there's a whole mythology that goes with this too, and actually, it's wrong to reject the mythology, but there's a lot that can be said about that. Sometimes I think of it, but again, this is in kind of my literal, materialistic kind of way. There are some truths that are bigger than the literal, strictly objective, going to satisfy everybody meaning. It's like when you say, it's more accurate to say, for instance, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, rather than saying, the pH content of my stomach is 4.65. One is very scientifically on the nose, but the other actually has more meaning to it. And truly, our mind is greater than that, than those limits. Nothing wrong with science, but as far as it goes. So I wanted to share one with you. I'm reading another Life of the Buddha at the same time. This book, Rediscovering the Buddha by Hans Penner. Hans Penner was a professor of mine. And actually, looking back on it, kind of like the formal path started for me there. I didn't realize it at the time. But I took when I was in college, they had this new radical idea of pass-fail. Supposedly you're going to be better if you didn't have to worry about a grade. So you could take a certain number of courses pass-fail. So I took Hinduism, Buddhism, and in Hindu classics or something like that with Hans Penner, pass-fail. And I got, if I remember correctly, a C plus or a C minus, I can't remember. Even though it was pass-fail. But a brilliant man. And I still remember he passed away a couple of years ago, and Megan found this book and gave it to me. So it's a very interesting thing because he has the story talking about how this is presented in Asia as opposed to America. This is America and Britain, very, again, no one's going to be disappointed. The language is all very literal. And this is the mythology, including he starts the whole story with the Buddha's previous lifetime, which is a big deal in Asia, but we never even hear about it here. He had a form called Vesantara, and Vesantara perfected giving in that lifetime. And his next rebirth was as Buddha Shakyamuni. So it's interesting, but I was reading it today. Gretchen's back, and she heard me chuckling. She asked what I was laughing about. So just this little bit, this is the kind of thing that makes me something that seems very real, even in the mythological setting. So this is, the Buddha has come to his enlightenment, and he's like gathering students, and he's creating quite a ruckus in that part of northern India, because he had all these people that were, taking vows. And so he was criticized as being, he's ruining families, ruining families and kind of taking people away from their obligations to their families and extended families and society and everything. At any rate, as we knew, his father was a king. They may have been more like the actual kingdom he lived in was probably more like an oligarchy, where the kingship, so to speak, was rotated amongst the aristocratic families. But nonetheless, the story, the myth is that Suddhodana, his father, was a king. So he was a prince. So a man who was his childhood friend, named Kaludayan, heard about all the, not gossip, but news about all this stuff happening with this great enlightened figure, and went from, Kapilavastu, where they were living now in Nepal, about 300 miles to meet the Buddha. And then he became a monk too. And then the Buddha's father heard about all of this and invited him to come back. He wanted to meet his son again. And so the Buddha came. There was just like all this interest, public interest in that, and he was in some sort of a bamboo grove park, and his father was put out a directive: nobody can see him until I've seen him first. So his father was walking to the park to see him, and he kept bumping into these monks, and obviously the father didn't know about much about what had been happening, just sort of third-hand stories. And he saw these monks begging, and he got really angry, because my son could have been, a world conqueror, and what's he doing with all this begging? So he went home and he was pissed off, and he wouldn't go see the Buddha. But the Buddha knew his thoughts, and he told Kaludayan, I can't say the name, Kaludayan, his childhood friend, now a monk, why don't you go to see King Shuddadana and convince him to come see me. It's good for him to see me right now. And Kaludin hesitated, and he said, let's see. Yeah. But Kaludin resisted, saying, "It is very difficult to approach and suggest anything to a king. It is as difficult as approaching a blazing bonfire or approaching a 60-year-old elephant or a ferocious lion." Then the Buddha himself replied, "Listen to me, Kaludin. You are among those who repose in the perfection of merit. You can easily placate the king. You who have shared so much with the Enlightened One are the only one that can do it. There is no one else." Kaludin consented, and in an instant, this is what I love, appeared hovering over the king at the height of a palm tree and recounted the many noble qualities of the Buddha. King Shuddadana was pleased with what he both saw and heard, and told one of his counselors to prepare a proclamation bidding all Shakyans, that's the tribe, to come with me and meet Gautama. So anyway, well, what I liked was the combination in these myths with these things that sound very, very real. You know what I mean? There's this hesitation. No, I don't want to do this. People disagreeing, trying to talk someone into doing something. But yeah, the 60-year-old elephant, that was a new one to me. So along these lines, you know how we have this often in many of the prayers, you have this svaha at the end of a practice. Svaha. The Tibetans can't say V's, so they say Soha, but anyway, Svaha in Sanskrit. And Megan had a Sanskrit teacher in college who she translated, apparently Svaha is this exclamation that was made when like royalty or anybody would see a really, really fantastic war elephant, you know, with all the armor and just, you know, everything. It's just Svaha. And Megan's Sanskrit teacher translated that as damn. So it's good when you can make a dead language come alive, right? Okay, so we're continuing with the Buddha. So this story, or you know, is has a wonderful introduction to, or a discussion of, you know, the really kind of what was going on one level, because the Buddha took many teachings from his era, but totally transformed them, and at the same time made obvious discoveries. So it was just a very interesting thing. And you know, it's really amazing when you hear this. We'll hear some of this tonight of the conversions that were going on, so to speak. It's just hard to imagine because, again, no cell phones, no TV, no radio, no newspapers, none of that. Everything really by word of mouth. And yet the effect that he had on people, and as you know, life was unfolding with problems with the Sangha and everything. But nonetheless, a good deal of this section of the legendary biography is concerned with the consequences of this compassion, the formation of an order of monks following the Buddha. Buddha arose from solitude in his enlightenment and wandered by stages to the city of Benares. All right, so that's Varanasi. This is written in 1983, and Benares was still how it was been on the maps. It's Varanasi, where he stayed at the deer park at Isipatana. There he met 5 ascetics who had been with him before the awakening, but who had left in disgust when he gave up self-mortification. To them he addressed his first sermon, the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dharma, which enunciated the middle path and the Four Noble Truths. This they accepted. They became his disciples, and from that time on, many of his converts were drawn from the body of wanderers and ascetics. This is historically plausible to the extent that many of the Buddha's discourses were addressed to such wanderers, who were at the time a fluid group, moving easily from one teacher to another. But what was now at stake was the foundation of a new and enduring institution, the order, the Sangha of monks following the Buddha, and indeed one senses that the general fluidity was now crystallizing everywhere into separate religious corporations with their own constitutions. However, the Buddha was addressing an audience broader than just the religious virtuosi. The next convert was Yasha, a rich young layman who awoke one morning suddenly filled with disgust at the sight of the courtesans with whom he had been taking his pleasure now lying about him in drunken slumber. He wandered disconsolately to the deer park, and there he met the Buddha, who announced to him the Four Noble Truths. So Yasha left the world to join the Buddha and his small band. Yasa was a merchant's son, and according to the legend, 4 of Yasa's friends, from the leading merchant families of Benares, then became disciples, and then a further 50 youths from the countryside. These were the kernel of the new order, and indeed it was they who spread the teachings abroad. For in the legend, the Buddha now adjured them to go out and wander for the well-being and happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world. Quote. But they were no Protestant evangelists creating a church of laymen, for they were to, quote, propound the absolutely perfect and wholly pure life of a celibate mendicancy, unquote. Certain elements of this ring true. There was an elective affinity between Buddhism and city merchants, who were among the founding members of the complex urbane society which the Buddha's teaching addressed. But his was also a universal message, and many beside merchants, perhaps the youth of the countryside, must also have joined the order. The emphasis on the celibate life seems especially plausible, for it expressed the esprit de corps of the order, and it is consistent with the message of many of the discourses that the only truly rational course is to renounce the world. However, even if this uncompromising purpose was the original brief of the order, the missionary activity held within it the possibility of a profound involvement with the laity. For it was after all the layman's food which sustained, and their cloth which protected the mendicant missionaries as they spread along the trade routes through India and later throughout Asia. So laymen do appear in the legendary biography. Immediately after Yasha joined the order, Yasha's father came looking for him and met the Buddha, who preached to him. The father was converted. He gained confidence in the Buddha's teaching, and he thereupon went for refuge to the Buddha as long as breath lasts. Unquote. This going for refuge today marks formally a layman's commitment to the Buddha, his order, and his teaching, and it seems likely that it had a similar significance at the time of the compilation of the legend and earlier. Yasha's father then invited the Buddha for a meal, and while at the father's home, the Buddha converted Yasha's former wife and his mother as well, who also went for refuge to the Buddha. These events at Yasha's father's home convey the substance of the relationship between Buddhist monks and lay people. The lay people offer food and physical support to the monks, while the monks offer the lay people wisdom and other spiritual goods. Anthropologists are fond of discovering institutions based on long-term gift exchange, in which two parties establish a relationship by giving gifts to each other, then continue the relationship by the continued exchange of gifts, and this is such a case. On the layman's part, liberality, and especially generosity towards monks, is enjoined. Whereas on the monk side, the gift of the Buddha's teaching is the best gift, as the canon repeatedly asserts. The gifts are different in kind, but they are given freely, and through them lasting ties are created. Upon this mutual exchange, there was thus formed the Buddhist community as a whole, the fourfold assembly, which included monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. It was a community as a whole that achieved Buddhism's lasting success. So what the Buddha's teaching had to offer the laity was certain spiritual goods. Some of these goods were not offered by Buddhism alone, however. One was merit, an immaterial reward garnered by a layman simply by feeding a monk and listening to his sermon. Merit could be laid up to secure a better rebirth. The more merit in the spiritual account, so to speak, the better the rebirth. Hence, as there was a high spiritual purpose appropriate to the monk, namely liberation, so there was a lower one appropriate to the layperson, better rebirth, and the hope that one would eventually be reborn, in circumstances allowing one to become a monk and achieve liberation. This was a good reason for patronizing the Sangha, but in fact, it was also a reason for patronizing others, such as in Jain order as well, for they held a similar conception of merit. So the Jains, the founder of the Jains, I think his name is Mahavira, was a contemporary of the Buddha. He was older. There's no record that they ever met. But also this distinction, the four groups, laymen, laywomen, monks, and nuns. Right from the beginning, though, the stories are of enlightened lay people too. So although there is a distinction, certainly, at the same time, it's not quite as black and white as this makes it sound, that the lay people are just looking for a higher rebirth. For all, it's the practice of wisdom and compassion. Another spiritual good offered to the laity was a high moral teaching, composed of injunctions against such acts as lying, killing, and stealing, against gaining one's livelihood in harmful ways, and against destructive attitudes of greed, hate, and folly. The monk, with his strenuous discipline of self-control, represented the perfection of human virtue, but the basic principles of that perfection were adaptable to a lower level, to a morality fitting the compromised circumstances of a laity who had to make their living and bear their children in the world. The Buddha, however, held no monopoly of such teachings, whose novelty and popularity were linked with the relative newness and wide distribution of the now developing urbanized forms of social life. Now there were merchants who, through command of the impersonal instruments of money and trade, could wreak a new damage on others. Now there were states and armies with new capabilities of harm. Now there were offices to seek at others' expense. Moreover, life in the new cities required that groups who had no natural mutual interest or mutually inherited moral code had to devise ways of living together, with at least a bare minimum of trust. Much of the adaptation to new forms of life must have occurred quite apart from the renouncers, but the renouncers gave form and voice to the change. They embodied the virtues of harmlessness and poverty. They sought no offices, and in their preaching they advocated virtues whose practice, whatever theory went with them, could render the new social world habitable. He started this book by a study of what he thinks was happening in the Ganges Valley at that time, that there was a lot of change and turmoil happening, turmoil in the sense of instead of the very rigid kind of roles that people had as represented in the caste system, they almost had to invent new categories or subcategories because there was all this economic activity going on and economic exchange among different tribes. So it was a time of kind of great fervor, intellectual anyway, spiritual. It's very interesting to me. I mean, this is like 500 BC, and it's about the same time as Lao Tzu in China, and it's about the same time as a little bit later, I think. I'm trying to think of the other figure. There's some figures in the Mid East that I'm not aware of, like Zarathustra, Mithras. There's some great spiritual figures happening at this time, and it was, a few hundred years later that Plato and Socrates were doing their thing, and indeed. Aristotle was that's later, but he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. So it's very interesting times. Okay. The teachings of merit and lay morality explain the renouncers and not merely the Buddha's success. Indeed, in ancient India, Buddhism would probably seldom have seemed markedly more successful than other movements, and taken singly, many of the Buddha's teachings to the laity could be found in other doctrines. However, the Buddha achieved a synthesis of the various elements which made the whole more than the sum of the parts. This synthesis thank you, is formed upon the Buddha's tendency to think in practical terms, on the analogy of craftsmanship, and also upon his concern with psychological explanations. we had something along these lines. Again, I mentioned on Sunday, Keen found a video of someone who's studied at the SOAS, Asian Studies, can't remember, the School of Asian Studies in London, which I think was funded in large, I mean, not in large, but Prince Philip, the former Prince Philip, was a big donor there. Megan's had some contact with some of the people there. At any rate, someone there who I think got a master's degree in Buddhist studies, and he produced some videos. And he's pretty much a Jungian, which is interesting in its own right. But his description, I thought, of one of those traditions called Yogacara, means the practice of yoga, was very fascinating, because this is where there's this analysis of how our mind, so to speak, exists. It talks about the 8 consciousnesses. The first 5, the ones that we all recognize, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. And then the 6th one is the mind. So the Buddhists consider the mind as being a sense also, the thinking mind. And he makes this interesting discussion of how, you know, in other traditions, and for that matter, even in our modern scientific way, you know, we think of consciousness as some sort of, I don't know, some sort of unit out there or something that's floating around and is like recognizing all these things. But in Buddhism, the organ, like the eye, and its object, color, shape, form, whatever, is like a lock and a key. And so when the two come together, visual consciousness arises. So, and with the thinking, rather than thoughts being something that is being created by ourselves, thoughts are just appearing when the thinking mind rests on an object, a thought. So this mental consciousness, this limited thinking consciousness arises. And this is limited, fundamentally limited. We normally don't see this, but this is the problem with our suffering and samsara, because it's just limited in what we're trying to effect. You know, if we're trying to understand something, we're just fundamentally limited because it's just based on this one aspect of mind. So you've got these 6 consciousnesses, and they're doing things, right? And there's also, how is it that we're just not sort of like fireflies going on and off, and there's nothing more to it? What holds it together? Well, it's this sense, which is the 7th consciousness, which is called the manas vijnana. I don't know Sanskrit or Tibetan, but occasional words. But I think this is so interesting, because manas means mind, and vijnana, jnana is you know, like knowing in a primal sense. This comes up a lot in our text when you see it, like when we're doing the White Tara mantra, that jnana is in there. And I think in the Heart Sutra, there's one little paragraph. I think there are 13 jnana roots that pop up. So there's such emphasis in Buddhism on understanding, but this primal understanding. But vijnana, V is to divide. So normally, in our normal samsaric way, we see the world as divisive, although it's not. Fundamentally, it's just this jnana, this completely, you might say, unified or not separate vision of things, understanding of things, how they really are. But yet, consciousness itself is vijnana, seeing things by the division. So male, female, black, white, you know, existing, non-existing, all these dualities were there. So at any rate, you've got this manas vijnana, this mind consciousness. This is where the ego resides. Now, it's totally sort of artificial, you might say, but nonetheless, there it is. And what is it doing? Well, all these reactions that we have are samskaras, they're called. They're like baggage. You know, when you see something that's painful, for instance, there's a seed of it, you've seen this reaction, or like, let's say, someone looks at a spider and it's like scary because you've been bitten by a spider in some of your experience. So there's this reaction. Well, those reactions are like seeds, it said, and they are transmitted by this sense of ego, which is like a conveyor belt, and it's thrown into what's called the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness. So just like Himalaya, alaya means storehouse, him means snow. So the Himalayas are the abode of the snows, or the storehouse of the snows. But now we're talking about vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, alaya vijnana. And so they're all there, they're unconscious to us. But all these seeds, you could think of them as, they're there. And when, through these 6 consciousnesses, as we go on, stuff comes up, they're like triggers. And the conditions that come up that can trigger those, this is karma. The results, our reactions, our emotional reactions, our prejudices, all that stuff is transmitted from the alaya vijnana through our sense of ego into the actual experience we're having with whichever sense is going on, or all of them simultaneously. So it's this very insightful kind of analysis, and this is just analyzing it from the self-liberation level, because actually the Yogacara is one of the Mahayana schools, and it's the primary teaching there is Buddha nature. So it's said that the Buddha himself, he revealed his teaching in 3 turnings of the wheel, it's called. The first one is what we've been reading about in this book: 4 Noble Truths, karma, no self, impermanence, suffering, dissatisfaction, the interdependent origination, pratitya samutpada it's called. These are the basic self-liberation. He started out by people understanding who and how we actually do exist as a human being, instead of these images that we have and these projections, all based on our self-grasping. So that's the first turning of the wheel, how to see who and what you are in your liberation. But then he did 2 further turnings of the wheel of the Dharma as he progressed. The first one, the second turning of the wheel, is great emptiness. These are the texts, the perfection of wisdom, the whole library of all the Prajnaparamita. I mean, we went above the altar, the perfection of wisdom in 100,000 verses. You've got the Heart Sutra in 1 paragraph, everything in between. So this is the teaching on great emptiness, the perfection of wisdom. The third turning of the wheel are the teachings in what's called Tathagata Garbha. Garbha is womb. And the Tathagatas are the thus come ones. The Buddha's was so profound that his students, is like they didn't feel right, like putting a title on him. So they had these, addressing him even by his name. So they had these titles like Tathagata, the thus come one. That's what the Buddhas are. Another one was the Bhagavan. You see that in some of our prayers. Bhagavan just means the world honored one. What are you going to do? You don't see even images of the Buddha in art until maybe 200 years after he passed away, because they just held that he was just so that would somehow give people the wrong idea, or so limit, conceptualize something that was so vast. So you can go to India today and you can see, a throne with all these people kind of making offerings to this throne, and the throne's empty. There's a Dharma wheel there symbolizing. Like that. So you had, anyway, the teachings of 4 Noble Truths, teachings of the great emptiness, and the teachings of Buddha nature. The Yogacara is in the Buddha nature school. It's represented by the sutras, the Lankavatara, the Avatamsaka, the Samdhi Nirvana, different sutras. And interestingly, because our particular tradition, the Kagyu, holds the first teaching, the first turning, to be provisional. These are not the ultimate or definitive truth. The second turning of the wheel and the third turning of the wheel, great emptiness and Buddha nature, are definitive. That's kind of the first teachings lead to that. Now, interestingly though, the Dalai Lama school, the Geluk, consider the second turning the wheel definitive, but not the third turning the wheel. Again, this is the difference. Like Kempo would have a debate with one of the Dalai Lama's monks, for instance, because the Dalai Lama's tradition says that the Buddha nature, the great emptiness, is just like too sort of profound for people. So they give you a teaching on Buddha nature to help you move in the right direction. But the Nyingma and the Kagyu disagree with that. So these are little disagreements that don't matter to us, and I don't think they matter to the Dalai Lama either. It's not like it's not like you're taking a certain academic position and you're not going anywhere. Garam Rinpoche has taught that all these different interpretations. Everyone okay?
Well, I was on the Twilight Zone for a minute.
Right. All right, we'll keep going. At any rate, where were we? Garam Rinpoche has said that the Dharma is like a big jewel diamond with many facets. And these facets exist for the benefit of the students. People come at it from different angles and they help sharpen the mind you're trying to understand. And this is all very helpful because in the end, it's the same thing, you might say. In fact, I think we'll have to check with Khepo in this, but I think one of the characteristics of Jigten Sumgön's teachings, so again, founder of the Drikung Kagyu, this gets really into the weeds, I know, but Jigten Sumgön, why he's considered a great figure all within Tibetan Buddhism itself, just like the Dalai Lama is, no matter what sect you're in, is that he said the whole thing is profound. So he doesn't really get into this. In one way, you can talk about provisional, definitive, and all of that, but actually those seemingly provisional teachings are absolute also. So anyway, I think we can do that. Yes.
I'm so sorry about that horrible noise.
That was,
That was our fault because we had any. Doesn't matter. Oh, I'm sorry. I had a question. Could
Yeah.
you go back a little bit and explain about how the Gelu consider one thing definitive, but Kagyu consider something else definitive?
you're breaking up a lot. Could you ask it again about how the question about the Geluk and the second turn of the wheel?
Yeah. Could you explain how one group considers one turning definitive and the other considers another thing definitive?
Yeah. The Kagyu and the Nyingma say that the perfection of wisdom is a definitive teaching, that all of reality, you might say, is marked by this vast emptiness. In the extreme example, like in our particular tradition and almost all of Tibetan, they're followers of what's called the Prasangika Madhyamika. And when I say these words, people think I know what I'm talking about. But it's this teaching on there's just nothing that can be attached to. So for instance, in so many religious traditions, there's this idea of consciousness is this vast oneness, and we're all oneness in this consciousness. But the Buddhist idea is so radical because he said even that is a creation that is dependent on, that is impermanent on itself. So this is what he discovered in his accomplishment of the greatest meditation teachings of his day. That even though there was this vast state of neither perception nor non-perception, that you could rest in that for eons, but eventually you fall out of it because it's not final. And it too is a constructed state subject to impermanence. So his teachings on the vast emptiness is not a oneness, but it's a not two-ness, which is really mind-boggling to study because the not two-ness means that each one of us can be exactly what we are. We're not trying to, like somewhere there's a verse about the drop of water dropping into the ocean and just sort of disappearing. But that's not the Buddhist idea. That's more like a Hindu idea. We're just trying to merge into this great oneness. There's that state exists, but it's not the ultimate state. Instead, this not two-ness means, in a sense, we're all together in our nature, but we're not subsumed into it, you might say. We're completely free to be ourselves. This is the great liberation. You can see what you're doing, the awareness itself. So that's the great emptiness. Now, the other teachings, the third turning of the wheel on Buddha nature, basically this is where the dispute comes in. Because although the Geluks would say, well, the great emptiness, that's the final thing. But the Nyingma and the Kagyu say, well, this Buddha nature, though, this great emptiness has quality. Now that sounds like a contradiction, of course. How can it have quality? Quality itself is empty. So in a sense, it's kind of a mystery, certainly. But it's a different philosophical attitude. And it might have something to do with the way that they approach the training too. In the Gelugpa, they study. So you have like a 20-year degree and you know stuff inside out. And then they start on the profound meditations. The Nyingma and the Kagyu, they say, well, yes, it's true that if you sort of get ahead of yourself, there are some risks in these profound meditations, but at the same time, life is short. we got to take a few risks. I'm making it much sharper than it really is in the actual practical practice. But it's a difference in attitude, and I think a different quality that comes out. But it also works for different sort of makeups of people. I think one of the greatnesses of this is you don't have to fit yourself into somebody else's idea of what a spiritual box should be like, and you were to cram you in there. I saw a picture today, for instance, someone had one of these things that floats around the internet of how do you explain your cat's weird behavior? And one of the ones they mentioned, they had a picture of a cat like crammed into a shoebox like you can't imagine. They like to get into these funny places. So we don't have to push ourselves into a box that's defined by Buddhism. This is about the mind. It's vast. In a sense, there are no rules. But nonetheless, there's a lot of valuable stuff that can be learned by those discussions of the three turnings of the wheel. But nonetheless, I forgot what led me into this. Forgive me. Something in our book. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So again, in my own limited experience, the incredible skillfulness of this. Like the other night, we're doing Vajrakalaya, and it just becomes clear to you, just even through repetition, just through practice, that this isn't something that was sort of composed by some charismatic man or woman 1,000 years ago. It's the interdependencies, the interconnections of it all. You suddenly have some sort of, it can just be an intellectual insight, but something that gains your faith, strengthens your confidence. It's just all one thing, you might say, but all these different expressions of it. In essence, there's no difference between Vajrakalaya and Tara, but nonetheless, different strokes for different folks, so to speak. So as long as there's this confidence that the Buddha wasn't mistaken, he wasn't insane, he wasn't drunk when he said that we all have Buddha nature, as long as one has confidence in that, then, there's a way you can't go wrong, because even the mistakes you make are part of the purification process. You're finding out what doesn't work. This can be really strong in a more intensive kind of retreat, like the kind of things that Garam Pache holds out in Arizona. You can have just all sorts of wrong ideas, or you know, you see all your inadequacies and all your strivings and all your plans and machinations and all this stuff, and how powerful they are. But with time, you know, they wither because they're not going anywhere, and you're in a state of looking at that. These things have real power when they're not acknowledged, when they're not seen. In truth, it's the awareness of the mind. I mean, again, this image that we have in the sadhanas is of a flame. That's the symbol for wisdom. And the Buddha said that actually in our nature, we're kind of like a burning flame. We're consuming all of these substances, you might say, all this stuff. But the flame itself, you can't put your hand on it. You know, there's not one thing there that's a flame. It's this dynamic process. And in that dynamism is actually our freedom. And yet we're trying to make things solid all the time. That can't be shaken, you know. But the real shaken is this understanding of the actual nature of things. Okay. So the last section, I think, of this little book, no, next to last section, is called The Doctrine of Skillfulness. And after that, the Discourse of the Kalamans. So, the Doctrine of Skillfulness. The key to this way of thinking is embodied in a term found frequently in the discourses. This term is kusala, whose primary meaning is skillful, as a goldsmith may be skillful in making gold ornaments. It is a term which the Buddha made his own, and he used it in the first place to refer to skill in meditation. But he also used it widely to apply to skill in moral discipline and the acquisition of merit. In this application, skillful also means morally good, as we might say he is a good man or that was a good act. Indeed, in many contexts, skillful is the opposite of evil and refers to the same kind of sharp distinction that is made in Christianity between good and evil. But for the Buddha, skillful/good always had a practical, not a metaphysical or absolute flavor to it. The dead center of the term is best conveyed by a sense lost to us, but still alive among the ancient Greeks, that just as one could be skillful at good or good at a craft, skillful or good at a craft, so one could be good at being a sentient being, and hence one could be good. The term was animated by thorough reflection upon the consequences of deeds, and in particular of the attitudes, the mental actions behind the deeds. For the Buddha's skillfulness cuts two ways. Its consequences were good for oneself, but good for others as well. For example, the act of giving food to a monk gained one merit, and indeed, with a characteristic Buddhist emphasis upon the mental side of things, this merit was conceived as being also a psychological good, a wholesome frame of mind pursuant upon liberality. Now, also this word merit, this is one that I think often has kind of trouble for us in the West. We had one woman here who went to the Kalachakra empowerment years ago and was very moved. I mean, she was like, you know, weeping, and it just felt like she had come home. But she had so much trouble with the term merit because it sounds like I've got merit and you don't. You know, it sounds like it's. I think because it's the Protestant culture, perhaps it's kind of judgmental. You know, it goes back to maybe. I mean, who knows these things? It's all cultures are so complex, but it always reminds me of Calvin. You know, kind of being the dictator of Geneva or whatever he was, and this idea that there was an elective people that God had selected, nothing you could do about it. You were going to heaven, everybody else is going to hell. And so people, as people are, wanted to appear like being one of the elect, even though the theology was nobody could know. So everybody started acting, you know, in very kind of Protestant ethic kind of way. So we have that kind of coloration of merit. And of course, I'm sure the word in Sanskrit or Tibetan doesn't have the same baggage as the word merit does for us. You know, it's culturally bound. Yeah, merit badges. I mean, there's good there, but there's also, we have this hesitation, especially people who are attracted to the, you know, the great freedom of the Dharma. It just seems wrong that I should be, you know, merit. It's like a competition or something. But merit, I think of it as just the positive inertia, the positive momentum that happens as the mind is trained. You know, I've sometimes said it's like things just start working. It's like you flip the light switch and it goes on. That's merit. Stuff is just happening. And so it's just a natural process. And it's true. I mean, really, who knows these things? You find things going smoothly in your life. You know, 99% of that has nothing to do with your willpower or anything like that. All the things that, to give you an example, this has nothing to do with merit for me, but I got appointed to represent someone, and I was also already appointed to represent her for another child. This is two different family court cases. But she fired her attorney in the first one, and the court appointed me to represent her, and they sent all of the paperwork for this particular case to me, and I opened it up, and then you know how once you open something in your email, then it's not bolded anymore, and it just like looks like you've read it. So I looked at it, and there was just this whole stack of downloaded documents that I had to print out, but I didn't have the time to do it at the time, or was lazy, who knows. So I didn't do it. So they were sitting there, and I forgot that I had them. And then, because I was so involved in her other case, and last night I looked at my calendar and said, damn, there's a trial tomorrow, on Friday rather, trial on Friday. And I looked at the documents, and it said you have to give the court a list of who the witnesses are going to be 7 days before the trial. And that includes the parties themselves. They can't testify unless you've put them on the list and put it in there. So, and I hadn't even read the papers. I was totally screwed. And I thought, what am I going to do? And I know this judge, she can be a little angry, especially with this kind of stuff like this. So you're just thinking, like, well, nothing I can do, you know. So I called the other attorney, and he said, well, actually, I'm not representing that guy anymore either. So there was all this turmoil kind of going on lawyer-wise behind the scene. But I finally emailed the court and I said, I'm sorry, I just can't do this. I have to ask you for more time. The judge was already past the time that her boss said the case should be done. The state tells them a certain time limit. So I thought, wow, what are you going to do? No choice, really. Well, then it turns out that they did reschedule it, because there are three attorneys. There's the attorney for the father, the attorney for the mother, and then there's attorney appointed for the child. Well, in this case, the attorney for the child got sick. I had seen her yesterday, she was fine, but she got sick, so she couldn't do the trial either. So they switched it, and the judge said, the court said the judge is adjourning the case for rescheduling for the sole reason that the attorney for the child is ill. It's kind of slapping me up, like, yeah, not doing it for you, you know. It's all right. But to me, that's an example of merit. And I don't mean that I did anything meritorious. No, I didn't. But what I mean is when things kind of go smoothly, when you didn't really have anything to do with it. In fact, you may have just really screwed up too. Now, we all have that. To be born as a human being means that we've had a tremendous amount of virtue in past lifetimes and a tremendous and sort of an equal amount of negativity. So this is paradoxically said to be the best platform from which to realize your true nature. Because if we're like in a heavenly kind of realm, and we can see this in a human way too, when there's just stuff's going really well, you're not thinking about how you're going to improve your mind. You're not thinking about what you did wrong and how you can make it better. You're just riding on it. You're eating the seed corn. You know, you're just going on your own momentum. But then of course that runs out. But conversely, if we have too much suffering, like in the animal realm, the hellish realms, you know, it's like when you have a migraine headache or something. You don't have time to be meditating. I mean, a great person can, I suppose, but mainly you're just so taken up with the suffering. So the human has enough coming together that we have enough intelligence and virtue that we can think about this and want to improve, but we also have enough suffering that we have proper amount of, not too much, middle way of motivation to get out of this scene. So anyway, I think that's an example of how it works. Oh yeah, give Gretchen the mic.
I think one place where people might get tripped up, in our culture is that merit doesn't, in this kind of merit, Buddhist merit or whatever you want to just merit, doesn't imply you're a better person
Right,
than your neighbor necessarily. You're
Right.
both good people,
right.
And I think some people object to,
They hear it that way.
they hear it that way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Gretchen. It's so important to have, this is what's so especially valuable about all the what are called conventional teachings. It's like Nagarjuna said, we get to the absolute understanding through the relative teachings. It's so helpful because I think even, the little bit when you learn some of these words, even like Vijnana, I just found that myself when I first learned that so helpful. There's Jnana, like absolute wisdom. And yet that V divided. So in our ordinary consciousness, we actually have that absolute wisdom, but we're seeing it, we're experiencing it in a fractured kind of way. And so then you start to understand, the structure. All of Buddhism is nothing but calming the mind, meditation, and then insight into the nature of the mind. And so that example you've heard me give so many times, it's like our mind is like a pond or a lake, but the surface is stirred up by the winds. And because it's like that, the full moon is shining, but we see it in a fractured way. All these little moons and parts of moons and all of that. So what we have to do is calm that down. When you calm that down with shamatha meditation, what happens? Suddenly your mind the lake becomes like a mirror itself, and you're seeing this perfect image of the moon. They have a term for it in the teachings, I can't remember what it is. We're not actually seeing the real moon, but we're seeing a perfect representation of it. So that's extremely helpful. And then as we go into that, you actually do experience the moon itself, not just its reflection, and you become the moon, you might say. And then you go beyond. So what's very helpful, I think, is that in the language, in both Sanskrit and Tibetan, and kudos to the Tibetans for not sort of screwing it up, we're going to make it better. Instead, they did this just but not this narrow kind of attachment to a particular term or everything, but they got the spirit of it and only changed it in certain situations, but they had almost this literal translation from Sanskrit to the Dharmic language of Tibetan. And this is very helpful because it allows us to think, allows us to analyze, allows us to question. So we didn't come anywhere near through finishing the book because Frank has got a big mouth. Sorry. Next time we should be able to do it. Now we're in skillfulness. That wasn't very skillful, was it? All right. So questions? Yeah, go ahead. Microphone, Keen.
Oh, yeah, I can't point it towards us. So the second and the third turnings is the emptiness is the second is let me think object oriented and the third is subject oriented.
No, they're neither really. They're just expressions of whether it's a subject or an object. There's none of that. They're just the great emptiness.
Oh, okay.
Neither short nor long, neither subject nor object.
That's what the non-tunus it means then.
Yeah.
I read some
Well,
Tibetan.
yeah.
I read some Tibetan description of that explanation of what those two were, but I don't know.
Yeah, there's just a whole bunch of teachings on the turnings.
Is that where Shentong and Rantong is too?
No, I don't know anything about those two.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know if I could, it's not, but I can confuse everybody. It seems to me that you would, up until recently, until I met you, that the
obviously the turnings of the wheel were done out of order. You'd think they would go the first, the third, and then the second.
Yeah, you're a Galuk.
But right, of course, yeah. But
Well,
I
like-
think they were taught in order. So yeah, I think they were absolutely taught in order.
There you
So
go.
anyway, I had all
There you
these
go.
comments, but
I think Patty had a
yeah.
comment or question too. Pass the mic back to Pat.
Going back to the third turning of the wheel, with Buddha nature being like the resultant path, like, when we see ourselves in practice as the Buddha, we have Vajra pride. So I guess what is the relationship between Vajra pride and Buddha nature in relationship with the three turnings of the wheel? Because like it seems like we have as Kagyu more emphasis on practice, a little bit like, more emphasis on practice. Obviously, we know
You
that.
jump into practice earlier, so to speak.
Yes, correct.
So you're
Like you don't have
practicing
to.
and studying at the same time, and yet the Gaelics, you're not going to get that empowerment right now. You need to study this really much more. They're very, very solid about that.
Right. And I guess our karma is a little bit more loosey goosey, where we're just practicing right off the bat. Like you walk into, a session of Vajraklaya and you're like, huh?
Right.
Like you don't really know what you're doing and you're, fumbling toward ecstasy, they say. But I was wondering if you could follow that up with any book recommendations on provisional and definitive and that.
Yes, but
Information.
I'll have to think about that.
Okay. Nope.
I haven't read it for a long time, and this is kind of fun getting back into it. When I saw that video that Keen provided, it was great to think about Yogacara. Yeah, I'm thinking Megan's teacher at Berkeley. I don't know if he still does, but he was originally a practitioner of a Chinese sect. I can't remember the name of the Japanese, in which it's a Yogacara practice. They consider that the highest teachings, whereas most of the Tibetans, most of the Chinese, most of the Japanese too consider Madhyamaka the higher teaching. So they interpret Yogacara in light of Madhyamaka rather than the other way around. But again, it's a very heady kind of thing, and I think valuable. Kind of look at maybe this one's right. Maybe this one's right. So you,
What Kempela told me, because when I first got here, I was just intellectual, and Garupa, I was just all over the intellectual. He finally told me that all Buddhism is the same, leads the same place.
see, that's Jigchen Sumghen's position.
He's just like,
Yeah.
Rogo, all Buddhism is the same.
Right. And that completely, think what it does. It completely relaxes you. You're not into some sort of battle of the bands anymore. And this is especially important for us, I think, because in the West, I mean, look at our religious traditions. It's all totally fractured. When a person tells me they're a Christian, I have great admiration of Christianity, but when people say they're a Christian, I don't really know what that means anymore.
I'm not sure that everyone saying that knows either.
Well, no, and that's true. And that's true.
With all honesty.
Yeah, that's not really a criticism. It's just where it's at. They're very tremendous, powerful things, positive things, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, it's I know, what does it mean? So the Dharma, wonderful. Again, Megan, one summer was in a Chinese monastery in Taiwan, and she shared some of the teachings that were translated into English, the same teachings that we have. And I just thought, how do you with that kind of separation for centuries, you don't muck it up, and it's not this rigid adherence to some sort of particular teaching, rather it's always alive because they're practicing it and realizing it. But I just think of it as such an incredible human story. I joke that it's like, it's not like Homer Simpson, so they got Homer Simpson in charge of the nuclear reactor, right? They recognized a long time ago the Dharma was so powerful, but so sacred, so completely beneficial for people. You don't want to screw that up. You don't put Homer in the operations room. Terrible jokes I make, sorry.
Frank, this is a terrific book. Really terrific book. We enjoyed it a lot. And what's coming up next in terms of, have you selected a next text?
No, I'm cogitating on that right now, doing a little exploration, and we'll see. But we still have, I think we have one more section, one more night on this book, because I lab.
Yeah, so we'd probably end up ordering it and getting a copy.
We'll put it out as soon as we know which book it's in, so people get a lead time on it.
Beautiful.
All right, so let's do the dedication. We share the merit from this evening with all motherly sentient beings. May we never forget the suffering of others. May we realize the gratitude that we have for what we've inherited from this infinite net of beings. And may we never stop until each and every one is free.